Chapter 3. The White Maw. The cistern lane ended at a wall painted with saints, whose faces had weathered into blank ovals. Rainwater ran down their robes like tears. Mara found the West Ledger marker exactly where Thomas's voice had said. 17 names scraped off the stone beside a locked maintenance gate, not missing by accident, cut away. The bell warmed in her pocket as she touched the scratches. The gate opened when she pressed the bone clapper into a knot shaped like a crescent. No mechanism sounded. The metal simply yielded, as if the city had remembered a permission it thought it had revoked. Beyond lay a stair corkscrewing down into damp dark. Mara lit a tallow lamp from the match safe in her sleeve and descended. The walls were lined with devotional plaques, each etched not with prayers, but with phrases. I carry what carries me. Mercy is a hand over the mouth. The chosen do not drown. The 10th step made it plain. They are feeding it, not with corpses alone, with language, with repetition, with a whole city's trained surrender, one approved phrase at a time. Some phrases had been touched so often, the stone around them was polished smooth. She ran her thumb over one and felt absurdly the residue of mouths. How many people had been taught to press their lips there in obedience? How many had gone home repeating words they believed were medicine? At the 23rd step, she found children's handprints whitewashed onto the wall. At the 30th, niches holding sea lavender tied with black thread. At the 41st, marks at shoulder height, where anxious hands had steadied themselves for generations. The stair was not merely hidden architecture, it was used. Hidden horrors were one thing, maintained ones required commitment, a staff roster, a budget line. At the 52nd step, she found offerings no official rite would have sanctioned. Fish vertebrae threaded on red string, a copper tooth nailed into a crack, a tiny wax moon blackened on both halves, folk gestures, counter-prayers, little private negotiations made by people who had correctly guessed that whatever lived below the quarter was older than the church, and probably less sentimental. The air changed as she went deeper, less salt, less damp, drier, older, that scorched mineral smell, the smell of rock that had once been molten, thickened around her like a second atmosphere. Before the first tower, before the first bell, something had arrived here. The crater had not been made by fire or water or the slow arithmetic of geological time. It had been made by weight, by something that fell from very far above and struck the earth with the force of an unanswered question, before any human eye existed to observe the aftermath. The church had found the wound, and the church, being what churches are, had decided that what waited below was not a problem to solve but a resource to administer. The stair ended in a vaulted chamber beneath the crater quarter. Above her, somewhere distant, processional drums. Through a crack in the stone ceiling, moonlight fell in a white bar despite the clouds. Ahead, dozens of people moved in silence across a wide terrace of wet rock. Pilgrims, beggars, mothers with hollow-cheeked children, men missing fingers from the brine factories. All wore white strips tied over their mouths. At the far end stood a line of priests in black and silver vestments, and beyond them a fissure in the earth wide enough to swallow a chapel. It looked less like a wound than a mouth interrupted mid-word. The upper stone was chalk pale, that same strange high albedo Mara had noticed from outside, too bright for its surroundings. Farther down the fissure the rock turned glass black, fused by ancient heat. Mist rose from within, carrying a mineral cold that prickled across her face. She had expected depth. She had not expected appetite. The fissure breathed. She could feel the exhalation on her cheeks, rhythmic and measured, like something below that had learned to approximate the intervals of breathing without understanding what breathing was for. Mara crouched behind a fallen saint and watched Bishop Caldron raise both hands. She had seen him only from a distance before, a serene public man with a grief-soft voice. Here he looked harder, younger, sharpened by secrecy into something closer to his actual shape. Publicly, Caldron specialized in the careful administration of despair. He spoke at flood memorials, grain shortages, and plague anniversaries in a voice so measured people mistook it for tenderness. Thomas had once called him a masterpiece of weaponized consolation. Mara had thought that excessive. She now understood Thomas had been charitable. "Blessed are the emptied," Caldron said. The crowd answered through cloth. muffled and one-bodied, for they may be filled. 3 bells answered from somewhere below the terrace, not in harmony, but in descending intervals. The fisher seemed to listen. Mara felt the sound in her teeth before she consciously heard it, the way storm pressure reached the joints before rain reached the harbor. Caldron motioned, and the first pilgrim stepped to the fisher edge. Mara expected a push, a blade, some visible violence. Instead, the woman bowed and walked into darkness as gently as stepping into bathwater. No scream followed, only a rising note from somewhere below, vast and deeply pleased, the sound of something that had been waiting long enough, that patience had become indistinguishable from hunger. Then it stopped, and the city bells, all of them, tolled one note in perfect unison as if answering a signal. Another pilgrim stepped forward, then another. One was carrying a child asleep against his shoulder. A butcher's wife stepped to the edge in her work apron, with the terrible calm of someone prepared over months, in doses small enough to feel like care. No chains. That was the filthiest part. They had made the victims cooperate with the story of their own consumption, had rehearsed it with them, Sunday after Sunday, until the walk to the edge felt like arriving somewhere they had always been going. On the chalk wall beyond the fissure, almost hidden by vapor, rows of cuts scored into the stone. Tallies, hundreds of them. Some worn soft by years of condensation, some sharp and recent. The church had been counting offerings for far longer than any surviving public ledger would admit. The bell in her pocket rang by itself, heads turned, caldrons included. For one impossible second his gaze met her hiding place exactly. "Bring her out," he said. Hands seized her from both sides, not priests, pilgrims. Their eyes were glassy and moon-pale, pupils blown wide in a chamber that was not that dark. Mara drove an elbow into one throat and tore free, lamp swinging. Oil splashed, fire licked across old prayer cloths and up a saint's wooden arm. Panic broke the crowd at once. The trance was thinner than fear, a surface tension that broke at the first disruption. Mara ran along the terrace edge while smoke curled under the ceiling. Someone shouted for guards. Someone else shouted that the maw was open. A child cried for his mother. The fissure below answered with a sound like a choir inhaling through wet lungs. Not alarmed, not distressed. Noting, taking inventory of what was being interrupted and filing it accordingly. One priest dropped to both knees and tried to keep reciting over the chaos, voice rising with every failed repetition. "Blessed are the emptied, blessed are the emptied." He sounded less devout than procedural, as if the right sequence of words might still restore order. When a strip of burning prayer cloth slapped across his shoulder, he screamed like any ordinary man and rolled in the wet stone with everyone else. She nearly collided with a girl, no older than 12, standing barefoot in the path, mouth bound in white cloth, eyes half-dazed. Mara tore the cloth down and shoved the child toward the smoke, where fleeing bodies were thickest. "Run uphill," she said. The girl stared at her as if the verb had lost meaning. Then a sink pole toppled in sparks, and instinct returned. She vanished into the chaos. At the far end of the terrace, Mara found a stair climbing toward the surface and took it 2 steps at a time. The last thing she saw before turning the corner was Bishop Caldron standing calm amid the rupture, untouched by the smoke, not frightened by the fire at all. He was smiling, not the managed smile of a man enduring inconvenience, the private smile of someone who has just confirmed that the asset he was looking for had walked through his door of its own accord. The stair did not return her to the street. It rose into a chapel vestry no public map admitted existed. Robes hung in damp rows from iron hooks. Silver masks lay face up in a basin, each shaped with an expression of mild grief, the kind that comforted donors because it suggested sorrow had already been organized by someone competent. Mara shut the vestry door behind her and heard the hidden latch lock itself with a soft, offended click. Outside, bells began to argue. The ordained evening sequence had always moved east to west across St. Loss, Harbor, Fish Market, Lower Hospice, Salt Bridge, Upper Chapel, Crater Quarter. Tonight the order fractured. The Crater bell rang first, then the Lower Hospice answered twice, then 3 bells in the poor wards struck at once and stopped mid-note, as if a hand had closed around their throats. Mara crossed the vestry and found a window painted shut. She smashed it with a silver mask, wrapped her hand in robe cloth, and climbed into a narrow alley between two chapels. Smoke breathed up from grates in the pavement. Pilgrims poured from side doors into the street, some still masked, some sobbing, some furious without knowing at whom. A man in a butcher's apron staggered past, carrying the sleeping child she had seen on the terrace. The child was awake now and screaming into his father's shoulder. Good, Mara thought. Screaming meant the story had not finished eating him. Across the alley, a novice no older than 16 saw the bell at Mara's throat. His face went slack. "Keeper," he whispered. "Absolutely not," Mara said, and shoved past him. He did not chase. He dropped to his knees and began ringing a handbell so hard the clapper cracked. The sound followed her through the crater quarter. Windows opened above. Shutters slammed. Somewhere behind her, guards shouted her description, then contradicted each other because half the witnesses had seen a woman in a burned coat and half had seen, apparently, the saint's messenger covered in ash. St. Las loved witnesses until they became inconveniently plural. Mara tore the white strip from a fleeing pilgrim's mouth and tied it over her own hair. In the smoke and rain, it was enough. She joined a stream of people moving downhill, shoulders hunched, hands clasped, as if prayer could be mistaken for innocence. At the first bend, she ducked beneath a cart stacked with funeral candles and crawled out the far side slick with tallow. 2 guards passed close enough for her to smell wet leather. "Bishop says alive," one said. "Bishop can come fetch her alive himself. He says she has the bone key." The second guard swore with conviction. Mara waited until their boots faded, then ran. Halfway down Candle Ward, the city answered the riot in the language it knew best: paperwork. Notice sellers were already emerging from a rectory side office with damp printed sheets tucked under oilskin. Not handwritten orders, printed ones, prepared beforehand. She snatched one as she passed. Emergency devotional correction. All citizens are instructed to report unauthorized bells, unsanctioned mourning speech, and persons carrying altered burial registers. Mercy requires vigilance. At the bottom, beneath Caldron's seal, a line had been added in fresh ink. Mara Ansell is to be sheltered by no household, fed by no kitchen, named by no witness. For a moment the street narrowed around her. Not wanted, unnamed. The church was not merely hunting her. It was trying to remove the social permissions that made a person survivable in St. Las. Food, shelter, testimony. A body could run a long way. A name cut out of every mouth died faster. Mara folded the notice and put it in her coat. Evidence, she told herself. Also insult.